The church bells chimed, ringing through the small town like a warning bell to anyone daring enough to listen. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the leaves danced in the chill of the wind, heralding a day that would change everything. Inside the old chapel, adorned with chintzy flowers and garlands, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Few could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. At the altar stood Margaret, a mere 16, her heart racing like the wings of a trapped bird. The white satin gown, painstakingly crafted by her mother, felt heavier than a lead weight. She could see nothing beyond the swath of flowers before her, the lavish, suffocating decor blurring under the relentless glare of fate. Across from her, David, a man twice her age, adorned in a tailored black suit, gave her a smile that felt more like a predator's grin than a loving embrace. Margaret couldn't focus on his eyes. They were an abyss, and she feared she might drown if she dared to look long. She wasn't marrying David by choice. It was a decision her family made to secure their future, a bargain struck in the shadows of desperation. Her father, in his unrelenting pursuit of prosperity, saw a potential alliance in David, a wealthy landowner whose fortune was just ripe for the taking. Yet, as the priest began his solemn recitation, dragging her deeper into a contract she fought valiantly against, she felt a wildness stirring within her. It was the call of freedom, a scream of tenacity waiting to escape, but could she? Could a 16-year-old girl, weighed down with the chains of obligation, truly summon the strength to upend her world? Just then, an unexpected sound echoed through the chapel, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The heavy doors creaked open, and a figure rushed in. It was Samuel, the farmhand who worked the fields with her father. He had a rugged, rough-hewn charm, his clothes worn but his spirit unbroken. Samuel's eyes darted toward Margaret, catching her gaze and holding it steady. It was a moment that could have unfurled in slow motion, the world around them painted in hues of anxiety and hope. He called out, his voice carrying an urgency that reverberated off the chapel walls. The congregation turned as one, murmuring in shock at the interruption. "Don't do this." Gasps echoed, rippling through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Margaret's heart leaped. In that moment, time stood still. Could it be true? Did someone truly care enough to fight for her? "Samuel," the priest blustered, his voice trembling under the weight of tradition and decorum. "I'm doing what no one else will," Samuel shot back, his gaze unwavering, anchoring Margaret like a lifeline tossed into stormy seas. "You can't just stand there and let her ruin her life." David's eyes narrowed, the predator suddenly defensive, his facade cracking. Samuel challenged, stepping forward, his chest swelling with defiance. "You'll turn her into a prisoner." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, her pulse quickening in response to Samuel's words. Her heart raced not just because of fear, but also a budding courage fueled by the gaze locking onto hers. She wanted to be free, to believe that love mattered, that it could defy the hardened hands of fate. The congregation's murmurs grew, a boiling pot threatening to overflow. Some whispered in approval while others hissed in discontent. In the world they occupied, David was the man with power, his wealth a cushioning blanket over truth. But as Margaret looked between Samuel and David, she saw something deeper than just a man at odds with another. She saw choices unfurling like petals, possibilities that beckoned like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Margaret," Samuel implored, stepping closer. "You don't have to be afraid. Choose life." Her heart sank and soared all at once. Could it be that a simple farmhand, someone with little more than his rugged hands and fierce spirit, could show her the way? She was torn between the oppressive weight of expectation and a wild yearning for something more. The priest's voice broke through her thoughts, a feeble attempt to restore order in the chaos. He thundered, but the authority in his tone turned to confusion amidst the unfolding drama. The walls seemed to close in, but within that suffocating space, something flickered inside, a fragile flame igniting, illuminating the shadows. "Margaret," David's voice broke through, thick with frustration. "You will regret this moment." But as the words fell from his lips, something shifted in her. The fear that clawed at her just moments ago now muddled in a resilient fire, an innate rebellion flaring to life. "No." It was a whisper at first, barely escaping her lips, but power surged behind it. The words spilled out louder this time, tremors of strength tainting her voice. She felt the gaze of the room shift, not just her family's, but the townspeople, all resting on her. Samuel stood beside her now, the embodiment of her courage. In that moment, he was no longer just a farmhand. He was family, a kindred spirit who understood her plight and her heart. You don't have to do this. You deserve more than this life, this man. The tension thickened, crackling like electricity. Margaret felt a rush of clarity. The universe all but collided in that chapel. It was as if every decision she had ever made led to this point, the weight of expectation, the fear of displeasing her family, the notion of duty, each lighting the path of her heart. I choose, she shouted, her voice breaking through the cacophony. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the room, piercing the air like arrows. With each word, Margaret felt the chains loosening, the confines of her life unraveling as Samuel's steady presence bolstered her resolve. David's face contorted with fury, the trap he had crafted slipping through his fingers. "You'll regret this," he warned, bitterness oozing from his lips. Margaret declared, her heart echoing like a war drum. The gathered crowd swirled in a tumult of reactions. Some murmured their support, while others were appalled. Yet Margaret saw a glimmer of something freedom in the eyes of those who believed her, who shared her plight, who knew the prison of expectations all too well. "Choose love, Margaret," Samuel whispered, the words resonating in her heart like a sacred chant. She looked back at him, meeting his gaze with fierce determination. In that moment, with the congregation holding its breath, she took a step back from the altar and turned fully to face him. "I choose Samuel," she declared. "I choose my life, my future." A thunderous silence followed her words, as though the world paused, suspended in disbelief. And then, with an equally powerful gust, a gallery of murmurs erupted, pulling the air taut. David stood rigid, the fury and humiliation shining plainly on his face, but he could do nothing in this maelstrom of rebellion. The history she had been shackled to was now lifting like mist, revealing the gleam of possibility beyond the horizon. With those words, she turned to Samuel. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze expecting, but her resolve remained unshaken. Samuel smiled, pride shining like sunlight illuminating the path forward. Hand in hand, they stepped away from the altar and into the unknown. Amidst the whispers and uncertainty, they made their way toward the open doors of the chapel, each step echoing with possibility. The fragrance of freshly fallen leaves wafting through remnants of autumn in a life once confined, now bursting with potential. Outside, the cool breeze welcomed them like an old friend. It wrapped around them, lifting their spirits as they emerged into the bright light of day, two souls unbound, relentlessly chasing after dreams not yet realized. Behind them, within the now quiet chapel, the echo of choice lingered, a refrain of freedom sung in the heart of a girl who dared to follow her own song. The room felt suffocatingly hot, and as Margaret stood at the altar in her heavy white dress, all she could think was that she was suffocating under the weight of expectation. The church was filled with well-dressed guests, their whispers blending into a muffled hum that echoed around her. Bright flowers decorated the altar, but they felt more like chains than adornments. Today was supposed to be her wedding day, but she felt more like an unwilling participant in a play directed by someone else. Across from her stood David, a man twice her age, with slick-back hair and an expensive suit. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made her feel safe or loved. It was predatory, as though he were measuring her worth as if she were some prize to be claimed rather than a person to be cherished. She felt trapped, ensnared in a fate she hadn't chosen. This was not a fairy tale, but a nightmare that was unfolding before her very eyes. As the priest began to speak, the words blurred into an echo around her. She didn't hear the promises of forever or the sanctity of love, only the stifling feeling of dread. Margaret had been raised to obey, to accept her fate, but something primal stirred inside her. She longed to scream, to run away, to fight against the tides of destiny crashing down upon her. It was a war within her soul, a battle for her freedom. Just then, an unexpected sound pierced through her thoughts like a lightning bolt. The doors of the chapel burst open, startling the congregation and drawing every eye toward the disruption. A figure rushed in, breathless and wild. It was Samuel, the farmhand who worked her father's land. His tousled hair and dirt-stained clothes seemed out of place in the polished surroundings, yet he carried an air of raw authenticity that felt magnetic. He shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Even the priest's astonished features reflected a collective disbelief that someone would dare to interrupt a sacred ceremony. Elizabeth felt a tremor of shock ripple through her, but also a flicker of hope at the sound of someone she knew, someone she could trust fighting for her. She whispered, suddenly aware of the wildness in her heart. He called out, stepping forward with boldness that made him seem larger than life itself. "This isn't right, you can't marry him." David narrowed his eyes, irritation casting a shadow over his features. "You've overstepped your bounds, boy," he sneered. "On the contrary," Samuel shot back, determination fueling his words. "It's very much my concern, and it should be everyone's." Margaret felt a rush of warmth, a burgeoning sense of camaraderie blossoming between them. In that moment, Samuel was not just a farmhand. He was her ally, a breath of fresh air in a stuffy room filled with dishonesty and pretense. Her heart raced. Could she really do this? Could she stand up to the world that had conspired to dictate her life? The priest cleared his throat, struggling to regain authority over the unfolding drama. "This is highly inappropriate." But Margaret's gaze flicked between Samuel and David. David's smirk, once smug and self-assured, began to fade as he realized that he was losing control. Meanwhile, Samuel stood rooted in place, a beacon of strength and conviction that ignited something deep within her. "Margaret, listen to your heart," Samuel implored, stepping closer, his eyes pleading. "This man does not love you, he wants to own you." Margaret felt her throat dry as she considered his words. For years, she had been taught the importance of duty, of family reputation, but the way Samuel looked at her shattered the confines of those lessons. His love wasn't the smooth affection David offered. It was raw, real, and filled with the promise of freedom. Glancing at David, she saw his irritation transform into something more dangerous. His jaw clenched tightly, fury bubbling just beneath the surface. But it was too late. The spell had been broken. Margaret felt something start to unlock inside of her. She finally cried, shaking her head. "I won't marry you, David." The room erupted into gasps of shock and disbelief. The rich tapestry of her future, once painstakingly woven by others, now frayed and unraveled. David's smile faltered, and though anger flashed across his face like lightning, Margaret felt no fear. Instead, it was the thrill of liberation coursing through her veins. Here was her chance to become the author of her own story. "Margaret, think about what you are doing," David warned, his voice low and threatening. "I would regret spending my life in a prison of your making," she retorted, her voice steady, her heart pounding. The crowd's chatter filled the air, but in that moment Margaret found solace in Samuel's unwavering gaze. He respected her, valued her freedom and choices. A serenity settled in her heart, wild and freeing, and as she stood there, she realized this was more than just an act of rebellion. It was an awakening. "Margaret, come with me," Samuel urged softly, sensing the transformation as if the words had the power to lift her from the weight of obligation. In that simple statement, everything shifted. With every fiber of her being, Margaret wanted to say yes, but the fear of the unknown loomed large. What would her family say? What would the townspeople think? Yet as Samuel moved closer, she felt the gravity of her dilemma dissipate, replaced by a fierce desire to reclaim her life. Margaret proclaimed, surprising even herself with her own boldness. The eyes around her widened, but this time it was different. There were murmurs of approval, echoes of shared experiences, stories of other women who had been trapped in lives they didn't want. She was not just a girl rebelling against an unwanted marriage. She was a voice for every person stifled by societal norms, overbearing traditions, and crushing expectations. David snapped, his facade cracking. "You think this farmhand can give you what you need?" Margaret shot back, taking a step toward Samuel. "He sees me for who I truly am. He understands the weight of this choice." Samuel's face lit up at her words. It was the spark of mutual respect, a shared connection that transcended the confines of their upbringing. No longer were they merely trapped within the roles allotted to them. They were stepping into the unknown, hand in hand. The priest, bewildered and flustered, attempted to restore order, but the chaotic energy in the room had shifted entirely. The hope flickering in the back rows of the congregation started to spread, sparking reflections of courage amongst the guests who had once viewed Margaret as merely a bride-to-be. "I've lost my chance at love," David growled, venom dripping from his words, "but you'll regret this." His words hung in the air, a dark cloud of manipulation aimed at shaking her resolve. But now she saw the truth. He was not deliverance, he was captivity. "I refuse to live a life dictated by you, David." Her declaration echoed, fierce and unapologetic. As she locked eyes with Samuel, it was as if the world around them faded away. They were no longer in a chapel filled with judges. They were just two souls fighting for each other, fighting for their futures. The doors swung open wider and fresh air poured in, accompanied by the exhilarating scent of spilled possibility. The crowd began to murmur with newfound fervor, voices growing louder, cheering for a girl who had dared to say no. David pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted. The only family I am concerned with is the one I choose," Margaret replied, emboldened by the rhythm of the moment. With one final glance back at David, one last acknowledgement of her former life, Margaret strode forward and grasped Samuel's hand tightly. In that moment, they stepped over the threshold into the world beyond the chapel, where a new life awaited them, a realm marked by choices, experiences, and love of their own making. As they emerged into the sunlight, Margaret felt the oppressive weight of the church lift off her shoulders. The world stretched out before her like a blank canvas, waiting for her to brush vibrant strokes across it. With Samuel by her side, anything felt possible. Together, they would carve out their own paths and forge a love that was not born from obligation, but from mutual respect, shared dreams, and the fierce declaration of independence. They had faced the storm, and together they had chosen to love fiercely in the eye of it. The church doors swung open with a shudder, and a cold wind swept in, leaving whispers of unease in its wake. Inside, rows of eager faces awaited the moment they had all come to witness. Margaret stood at the altar, her heart drumming loudly against her ribcage. She was a bride on the verge of a life she never chose, suffocating in her elegant white gown, which felt more like a straitjacket than a symbol of love. Across from her, David, a man twice her age, smirked as if he were about to claim a trophy. His slick-back hair and tailored suit did little to mask the predatory glint in his eyes. In that moment, Margaret could feel the entire congregation watching them, but she felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare. The priest began to recite the familiar words, a soothing hum that should have felt comforting. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine. The question was a formality, but to her, it felt like the closing of a coffin lid. She could almost hear the chains clinking around her ankles as her father gripped her arm tightly, his approval hanging like an oppressive weight in the air. This was not just a wedding, it was an auction of her spirit. "I can't do this," she thought, glancing down at the floor, her mind racing. There was a flicker of hope, a notion that maybe, just maybe, she could escape. But how could she? Who would stand up for her? And then, out of nowhere, a narrow shaft of light broke through the gloom. The chapel doors crashed open. A figure stormed inside, drawing gasps of shock from the guests. It was Samuel, the farmhand who worked her father's land. Dust clung to his worn clothes and his hair was tousled wildly, but his eyes were fierce, reflecting a sense of urgency. He shouted, the word echoing off the stone walls like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. Time seemed to freeze, the priest mid-gesture, David's grin faltering as if the world had tilted off its axis. Margaret felt a rush of heat coursing through her veins, a surge of adrenaline mingling with disbelief. Samuel, with his eyes focused solely on her, had become her unexpected lifeline. She whispered, her heart racing. He declared, stepping closer, and the warmth in his voice wrapped around her like a shield. David snapped, the easy confidence he once held melting away like ice in the sun. Samuel shot back, his face a mask of determination. "You may think you have all the power here, but love can't be bought." Margaret took a deep breath, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. She felt all eyes on her, the weight of disapproval mingling with the call of defiance. but Samuel's fiery spirit ignited something within her, a flicker of hope that maybe she could stand her ground. David barked, his voice sharp. "You can't let this fool sway you." Margaret found her voice surprising even herself. Samuel's gaze never wavered from hers, and for the first time she felt understood. She had been taught to please others, to bury her own desires beneath a mountain of expectations. But now, as she stood against the man who had come to claim her, she began to question everything. "Margaret, think about your family." David pressed, desperation seeping into his voice. But all Margaret could think about was the life she wanted, the dreams that had once filled her with laughter and joy. She felt that this was more than just a wedding. It was the defining moment of her very existence. Margaret shouted, her voice rising above the din. The congregation shifted uneasily, the atmosphere thick with tension. Some gasped in surprise, others exchanged worried glances as the unexpected tension fractured the hushed sanctuary of the church. Samuel took a step closer, unwavering, as if he were a knight charging into battle. "Margaret, you don't have to do this," he urged, his sincerity cutting through the chaos. "You deserve more than this life of obligation and fear. You deserve love, real love." In that moment, Margaret felt the chains around her heart crack. Samuel was right. Love wasn't something you could force. It was as natural as the sun rising each day. It was warmth, it was choice, and it was freeing. The thought of spending her life as a pawn in someone else's game was suffocating. His face darkened, and for a split second she glimpsed the man he truly was behind the mask, the man they had all ignored. "You'll regret this," he hissed, anger pushing his words like daggers into her heart. But fear had lost its hold over her, replaced by an unfamiliar strength. "I'd rather regret being bold than regret being bound," she declared, looking straight into his eyes. A murmur swelled within the crowd as those mortified gasps turned to whispers of approval. She had stood her ground, and now everyone could see them. The ties of tradition no longer bound her. A new bond forged in courage took its place. Samuel stepped closer, standing beside her like a sturdy tree in a windstorm. "Let's go, Margaret. We'll make our own way. We'll find a life where you can choose your happiness." In that moment, standing at the crossroads of her destiny, Margaret felt the light of a new dawn beckon her forth. She grasped Samuel's hand tightly, feeling the warmth of his resolve seep into her. She shouted, her voice rising above the tumult, ringing clear and unyielding. In a breath, it was as if the world tilted back on its axis. David's expression morphed from shock to rage, but she felt no fear. Her heart was wide open, unburdened by obligation. As she turned her back on the altar, the symbols of a future she had no intention of accepting. David's voice cracked like thunder, but she was already stepping into the light, each footfall resonating with newfound strength. As they exited the church, the sunlight enveloped her in a warm embrace, washing over them like a cleansing wave. Outside, the world felt vast, filled with possibilities she had never dared to consider. She turned to Samuel, who looked at her with admiration, and in that gaze, she found the validation she no longer sought from anyone else. "Let's find a place where we can start again," he whispered, his hand still gripping hers. "We will," she replied, a smile breaking through the storm within her. As the two of them walked toward freedom, they could hear the echoes of disbelief fading behind them, but the path ahead was clear. It would be hard, they knew, and the future was uncertain. Yet, for the first time in her life, Margaret felt the thrill of making her own choices. Together, they stepped toward the open fields beyond the town, sunlight illuminating their way. In that moment, she knew that what she left behind would never define her again. They were two individuals reclaiming their autonomy, ready to carve out a love rooted in choice, understanding, and a fierce defiance against the chains of obligation. Margaret had not just walked away from a wedding. She had walked toward a future filled with promise, guided by the flame of her bravery. And in the distance, they could see the horizon, endless and ablaze with the colors of hope. With each step, they moved closer to a life that was truly their own, a journey that had only just begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the small town, but inside the church, shadows loomed ominously as if foreshadowing the turmoil about to unfold. Margaret stood at the altar, heart racing, her hands trembling in front of her. The elaborate white dress felt like a heavy shroud draped on her shoulders, weighing her down with expectations she didn't choose. Across from her, David, a man nearly twice her age, stood with a charm that was more predatory than romantic. His grin was unsettling, sending shivers down her spine. The priest began to speak, his voice a low murmur that barely registered with her. All Margaret heard was the muffled heartbeat of her own fear echoing in her ears. This was it, the moment that would seal her fate. She looked around the room, family, friends, all waiting for the spectacle of her subjugation. There was no one in the crowd who would stand against the tide pushing her toward this wedding, no one who would save her from this life she didn't want. The priest began, but Margaret's mind raced. Memories of laughter, dreams, and the scent of warm earth flashed before her, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the church. She could feel the weight of everyone's gazes upon her, a chorus of silent judges. She was trapped in a cage built from her father's ambitions, bound by a deal struck in shadows. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the church burst open, startling the entire congregation. A gust of wind swept in and strode Samuel, the farmhand from her father's fields, breathless and wild-eyed. His clothes were wrinkled and dusty, but his presence illuminated the room. He shouted, his voice powerful enough to cut through the murmurs, a lifeline thrown into the tumult of her despair. Gasps filled the air, a ripple of shock that spread like wildfire. The priest stammered, trying to regain control, while David's smile faded, replaced by a hardened glare. "Samuel," Margaret whispered, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Samuel pressed, stepping forward, his eyes locked on hers. Margaret felt a rush of adrenaline. With every word he spoke, the chains wrapping around her heart began to rattle. She had been taught to submit, to accept her fate with grace. But in Samuel's fierce, unwavering gaze, she saw the possibility of something different, a path paved with the freedom to choose. David interjected, his voice steeped in venom as he straightened himself, trying to regain the dominance he felt slipping away. Samuel shot back, fervor in every syllable. "It's everyone's business. No woman should be forced into a marriage against her will." Margaret's heart raced as she looked at Samuel, feeling the tide of her emotions shift. She wanted to scream out, to run away, but a part of her still clung to the idea of what would happen next. "Margaret," David said, his tone now laced with frustration, "think about your family." She laughed bitterly, though she felt like crying. "This marriage isn't about love. It's about your greed, David." With each passing second, the congregation's indecision morphed into a palpable tension. Some exchanged furtive glances of support, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Margaret could feel the heart of the room shifting, and Samuel's presence bolstered her resolve. "Margaret," he urged, taking a step closer, "you deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you can provide." His voice cracked through the fog of confusion in her mind. She started recalling fragments of her childhood when she would dream of running through fields, laughter trailing behind her, unfettered by societal chains. "David has no idea who you really are, Margaret," Samuel continued, his eyes softening as he spoke. "Neither do your family or those people in that pew." With the sound of those words, something shifted inside her. The heavy chains clinking in her heart began to break apart. She felt hope bloom, wild and fierce. "You're right," she murmured, her eyes zeroing in on Samuel. David's face twisted with rage, his possessiveness bubbling to the surface. "You ungrateful child." But rebellion coursed through Margaret's veins like wildfire, and she felt emboldened. She shouted, her voice cutting through doubt and fear. One by one, the people around her began to shift, some standing in solidarity with her decision, others visibly uncomfortable. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who felt trapped, every soul that ached for freedom. The words "I do" hung in the air, taunting her, but she would not allow them to bind her. She felt Samuel's hand graze her arm, grounding her an anchor to reality. "Let's leave, Margaret," he urged softly. David bellowed, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't know what you're doing." "No," she countered with a defiance that surprised even her. "I'll regret this wedding, this life you've planned for me." With her heart pounding like a war drum, she took a deep breath, her eyes unwavering. The tension in the church reached a fever pitch, the air crackling with unspoken truths. "I choose freedom," she proclaimed, her voice ringing out clear and strong. The crowd simmered with murmurs as she turned from David, stepping towards Samuel with newfound confidence. "Let's go, Margaret," Samuel said, his voice steady and reassuring. They walked hand in hand toward the doors, the congregation still reeling from the revelation unfolding before them. As they stepped out into the clear light of day, the warmth enveloped them like a promise kissed by the sun. Behind them, David stood shaking in anger and disbelief, the earth shifting beneath his feet. This was not how it was supposed to go. But Margaret no longer cared for his cruelty or his manipulations. She stepped into the world where she was free to choose, filled with possibility. Margaret asked, looking at Samuel with a blend of fear and excitement. "Anywhere," Samuel replied, a smile breaking across his face. "We'll find our own way. There are fields waiting to be explored, dreams waiting to be chased." As they walked away, hand in hand, Margaret felt the shackles of her former life clattering to the ground behind her. She was no longer the girl who would be traded for wealth or convenience. She was a woman stepping into a future shaped by her choices, a future bursting with possibilities. Margaret took a deep breath and let it out slowly, the air filling her lungs with a sense of liberation. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, catching sight of the church, now just a silhouette in the distance. Memories flooded her, memories of expectations suffocating her spirit. Those memories would linger, but they would serve as a reminder of why she had fought so hard for this moment. With each step, the bond between her and Samuel deepened, a sense of kinship growing stronger under the vast sky. Together, they would face the road ahead, built on respect, love, and the promise of a fresh start. Each moment became a celebration of their freedom, a testament to the power of choice. As they ventured into the unknown, Margaret felt a lightness in her heart, a balance shifting from fear to courage. The sun shone brightly above, illuminating their path. No longer was she constrained by anyone else's expectations. It was her life, her story, and she was the one writing it now. And in that vast, expansive world, filled with the scent of fresh earth and vast horizons, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning, a new chapter forged by her own hand, where love blossomed freely and the future sparkled with the promise of possibility. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the small town, but inside the church, shadows loomed ominously as if foreshadowing the turmoil about to unfold. Margaret stood at the altar, heart racing, her hands trembling in front of her. The elaborate white dress felt like a heavy shroud draped on her shoulders, weighing her down with expectations she didn't choose. Across from her, David, a man nearly twice her age, stood with a charm that was more predatory than romantic. His grin was unsettling, sending shivers down her spine. The priest began to speak, his voice a low murmur that barely registered with her. All Margaret heard was the muffled heartbeat of her own fear echoing in her ears. This was it, the moment that would seal her fate. She looked around the room, family, friends, all waiting for the spectacle of her subjugation. There was no one in the crowd who would stand against the tide pushing her toward this wedding, no one who would save her from this life she didn't want. The priest began, but Margaret's mind raced. Memories of laughter, dreams, and the scent of warm earth flashed before her, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the church. She could feel the weight of everyone's gazes upon her, a chorus of silent judges. She was trapped in a cage built from her father's ambitions, bound by a deal struck in shadows. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the church burst open, startling the entire congregation. A gust of wind swept in and enstrode Samuel, the farmhand from her father's fields, breathless and wild-eyed. His clothes were wrinkled and dusty, but his presence illuminated the room. He shouted, his voice powerful enough to cut through the murmurs, a lifeline thrown into the tumult of her despair. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. Time seemed to freeze, the priest mid-gesture, David's grin faltering as if the world had tilted off its axis. Margaret felt a rush of heat coursing through her veins, a surge of adrenaline mingling with disbelief. Samuel, with his eyes focused solely on her, had become her unexpected lifeline. "Samuel," Margaret whispered, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Samuel pressed, stepping forward, his eyes locked on hers. Margaret felt a rush of adrenaline. With every word he spoke, the chains wrapping around her heart began to rattle. She had been taught to submit, to accept her fate with grace. But in Samuel's fierce, unwavering gaze, she saw the possibility of something different, a path paved with the freedom to choose. David interjected, his voice steeped in venom as he straightened himself, trying to regain the dominance he felt slipping away. Samuel shot back, fervor in every syllable. It's everyone's business. No woman should be forced into a marriage against her will. Margaret's heart raced as she looked at Samuel, feeling the tide of her emotions shift. She wanted to scream out, to run away, but a part of her still clung to the idea of what would happen next. "Margaret," David said, his tone now laced with frustration, "think about your family." She laughed bitterly. "This marriage isn't about love. It's about your greed, David." With each passing second, the congregation's indecision morphed into a palpable tension. Some exchanged furtive glances of support, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Margaret could feel the heart of the room shifting, and Samuel's presence bolstered her resolve. "Margaret," he urged, taking a step closer, "you deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you can provide." His voice cracked through the fog of confusion in her mind. She started recalling fragments of her childhood when she would dream of running through fields, laughter trailing behind her, unfettered by societal chains. "David has no idea who you really are, Margaret," Samuel continued, his eyes softening as he spoke. "Neither do your family or those people in that pew." With the sound of those words, something shifted inside her. The heavy chains clinking in her heart began to break apart. She felt hope bloom, wild and fierce. "You're right," she murmured, her eyes zeroing in on Samuel. David's face twisted with rage, his possessiveness bubbling to the surface. "You ungrateful child." But rebellion coursed through Margaret's veins like wildfire, and she felt emboldened. She shouted, her voice cutting through doubt and fear. One by one, the people around her began to shift, some standing in solidarity with her decision, others visibly uncomfortable. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who felt trapped, every soul that ached for freedom. The words "I do" hung in the air, taunting her, but she would not allow them to bind her. She felt Samuel's hand graze her arm, grounding her an anchor to reality. "Let's leave, Margaret," he urged softly. David bellowed, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't know what you're doing." "No," she countered with a defiance that surprised even her. "I'll regret this wedding, this life you've planned for me." With her heart pounding like a war drum, she took a deep breath, her eyes unwavering. The tension in the church reached a fever pitch, the air crackling with unspoken truths. "I choose freedom," she proclaimed, her voice ringing out clear and strong. The crowd simmered with murmurs as she turned from David, stepping towards Samuel with newfound confidence. "Let's go, Margaret," Samuel said, his voice steady and reassuring. They walked hand in hand toward the doors, the congregation still reeling from the revelation unfolding before them. As they stepped out into the clear light of day, the warmth enveloped them like a promise kissed by the sun. Behind them, David stood shaking in anger and disbelief, the earth shifting beneath his feet. This was not how it was supposed to go, but Margaret no longer cared for his cruelty or his manipulations. She stepped into the world where she was free to choose, filled with possibility. Margaret asked, looking at Samuel with a blend of fear and excitement. "Anywhere," Samuel replied, a smile breaking across his face. "We'll find our own way. There are fields waiting to be explored, dreams waiting to be chased." As they walked away, hand in hand, Margaret felt the shackles of her former life clattering to the ground behind her. She was no longer the girl who would be traded for wealth or convenience. She was a woman stepping into a future shaped by her choices, a future bursting with possibilities. Margaret took a deep breath and let it out slowly, the air filling her lungs with a sense of liberation. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, catching sight of the church, now just a silhouette in the distance. Memories flooded her, memories of expectations suffocating her spirit. Those memories would linger, but they would serve as a reminder of why she had fought so hard for this moment. With each step, the bond between her and Samuel deepened, a sense of kinship growing stronger under the vast sky. Together, they would face the road ahead, built on respect, love, and the promise of a fresh start. Each moment became a celebration of their freedom, a testament to the power of choice. As they ventured into the unknown, Margaret felt a lightness in her heart, a balance shifting from fear to courage. The sun shone brightly above, illuminating their path. No longer was she constrained by anyone else's expectations. It was her life, her story, and she was the one writing it now. And in that vast, expansive world, filled with the scent of fresh earth and vast horizons, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter forged by her own hand, where love blossomed freely and the future sparkled with the promise of possibility. Together, they were unstoppable, ready to chase their dreams and discover the life that awaited them beyond the shadows. The church bells rang, drowning out the soft whispers of unease that floated through the gathered crowd. Margaret stood in front of the altar, her heart gripped by icy fear. She wore a pristine white gown, a cruel joke in a world where she felt anything but pure. It was her wedding day, yet the lavish decor and smiling faces could not mask the unease churning inside her. She was trapped, caught in a web spun by her family's ambitions and her father's desperate desire for a financially lucrative alliance. Across from her stood David, a man nearly twice her age, slicked back hair gleaming under the soft glow of candlelight. His smile was wolfish, more a display of possession than love. The priest began to utter the words that would seal her fate, but they felt like a choking haze that clouded her mind. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the pews, searching the sea of faces for someone to save her, but all she found were nodding heads and approving smiles. It felt like a performance with everyone playing their parts, and she was just a pawn in a game she had no desire to play. Just then, the heavy oak doors swung open with a crash that echoed in the hushed chapel. A gust of wind swept in, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and something wild. All eyes turned to see a figure rushing through the doorway. It was Samuel, the farmhand from her father's land, dust swirling around him like a storm. His jeans were frayed, and his shirt was stained from hard work, but there was a fierce urgency in his eyes that held the room's attention. He shouted, his strong voice breaking through the tension like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the congregation. The priest stammered, caught off guard, while David's grin faded into a frown, his composure slipping. Margaret felt her heart leap. Could Samuel be her savior? She whispered, torn between hope and fear. He pressed, stepping closer. His passion was palpable, and it ignited something deep within her, an ember of defiance that had been smothered for far too long. David snapped, regaining some arrogance. Samuel shot back, unwavering. No one should be forced into a marriage they don't want. Margaret felt the walls locking her and beginning to crumble with every word Samuel spoke. She had spent years adhering to the expectations placed upon her, believing it was her fate to be the obedient daughter. But as she looked into Samuel's eyes, a well of strength began to rise. His unyielding gaze told her she wasn't alone. David tried again, desperation threading his voice. She spat back, anger swirling inside her like a rising tide. This isn't about my future, it's about your greed. You want me as a trophy, not a partner. The crowd murmured, a wave of confusion and recognition passing through them. Many of the women in the pews had seen their own lives reflected in Margaret's struggle. People began to shift uneasily, torn between tradition and the growing realization of her plight. David barked, his face darkening with anger as his grip tightened on the edge of the altar. She declared, her voice gaining strength. The air felt electric, charged with the realization that she was stepping into the unknown. Samuel could sense the shift. Let's go. We can find a life together, one filled with choices, respect, and real love. Each word he spoke wrapped around her like an embrace. She could feel hope blooming in her chest. Did she have the courage to walk away? David shouted, panic lacing his features. You think this man can give you everything you need? In that moment of chaos, Margaret felt a comforting heat radiating from Samuel, urging her to throw caution to the wind. She suddenly realized, the truth crashing over her like waves against the shore. He sees me for who I really am, not what I'm expected to be. With her heart racing, Margaret spun to face David. She shouted, the words echoing with a weight that felt liberating. He stood stunned, disbelief painted across his face. The tension in the room grew thicker as the congregation held its breath. "You foolish girl," he spat. Margaret declared, her voice unwavering. She stepped away from the altar, feeling an exhilarating sense of freedom wash over her. Samuel stood beside her, his presence a pillar of support in her time of reckoning. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice a grounding force in the chaos. Margaret turned her back on the altar and on David, feeling the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. Each step away from the life they had designed for her felt like shedding chains forged in silence and fear. As they exited the church, a fresh breeze met them, filling her lungs with the scent of possibility. It was surreal, like stepping into a world where dreams could flourish unfettered by expectations. She asked Samuel, excitement and trepidation dancing in her heart. "Anywhere," he replied with a smile that lit up his face. "We'll find a place where we can be ourselves, together." With those words, a sense of clarity enveloped her. The decision to walk away wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was the beginning of a new life. She felt stronger than she had ever felt before. As they strolled through the field beyond the church, Margaret looked around and saw the endless horizon stretching out in front of her. No longer would she be confined by anyone's plans but her own. Samuel was right, they would write their own story. She mused, looking at him, disbelief mingling with hope. "Every journey has risks," he responded, "but taking a risk for your happiness is worth it." Margaret took a deep breath, absorbing his words. It was a revelation that resonated deep within her core. She no longer wanted to be shackled to fear or obligation. She yearned for a life where love was a choice and not a transaction. Weeks turned into months as they navigated their new life. Samuel found work in nearby farms, and they lived simply but happily. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries, fresh dreams that unfurled like petals in bloom. Margaret began to learn who she truly was, an artist, a dreamer, a woman with a voice. The first time she picked up a paintbrush again after leaving the church, she could hardly remember what it felt like. It had been years since she had painted, and yet the colors flowed from her like a rebirth. She painted wildflowers, mountains, and skies that echoed her spirit, bold, alive, and free. And every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel would sit beside her, his steady presence a reminder that she was never alone. He encouraged her to dream bigger, to reach for the stars even when doubt whispered to her. Together, they laughed, cried, and built a life woven with love and understanding. One night, as they sat under a blanket of stars, Margaret turned to Samuel, her heart brimming with gratitude. "You had the courage all along, Margaret," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. In that moment, she realized how far she had come. She was no longer the frightened girl who felt her life slipping away. She was a woman who had reclaimed her story, ready to write every chapter with passion and purpose. As the seasons changed, so did they. Together they faced challenges, the harsh winters, the unexpected storms, but they weathered them all. They created their own family, fostering friendships in the vibrant community around them, their home a sanctuary filled with laughter and warmth. Margaret had long since let go of her fear, allowing love to flourish instead. And with each nostalgic glance back at the life she stepped away from, she no longer felt regret. She felt gratitude for the lesson it taught her that true freedom comes not from a lack of constraints, but from the courage to create your own path. Years later, standing in a sun-soaked meadow filled with wildflowers, she felt complete. The vibrant palette of her heart was reflected in the brilliant colors surrounding her. Hand in hand, she and Samuel walked side by side, knowing they had written their own story, a story that began with a brave interruption and blossomed into a beautiful life forged in love and resilience. As they moved towards a new sunset together, Margaret smiled. She understood now that every choice leads to a life worth living, and together, they had chosen an extraordinary one. The church was alive with whispered excitement, the kind that ripples through a crowd when something extraordinary is about to happen. But for Margaret, the atmosphere felt suffocating, a heavy weight on her chest as she stood at the altar, her hands trembling slightly in front of her. Today was supposed to be one of the most special days of her life, yet all she felt was the cold grip of dread. In front of her stood David, a man nearly twice her age, tall and imposing in his tailored suit. He wore a smug grin that made her skin crawl, as if he believed he had already won some grand prize. Margaret could barely meet his gaze, her heart racing as she thought about what was about to happen. The priest began. Margaret's thoughts spun wildly, drowning out the sound of his voice. This was her marriage, crafted not from affection but from an obligation she never wanted. A deal struck in shadows, where love was just an afterthought. Her father had convinced her it was for the best, a union that would bring prosperity and security. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something horribly wrong about it. As the priest continued reciting beautiful words of love and commitment, a sense of panic began to set in. She thought of her life, her dreams, the laughter of her childhood fading into silence. Would this man, who saw her merely as a means to an end, ever look at her with kindness? Did anyone in this church truly understand the weight of what she was about to lose? Just then, the heavy wooden doors burst open, startling everyone inside. A gust of wind rushed in, accompanied by a figure who seemed to slice through the tension in the room. It was Samuel, the farmhand from her father's fields, looking disheveled but alive with urgency. Dust swirled around his feet as he stood there, eyes locked on her, unyielding and fierce. He yelled, his voice cutting through the ceremony like a knife. Gasps echoed off the walls, shock radiating through the congregation. Margaret's heart leaped, hope igniting within her for the first time that day. Samuel was here and he was fighting for her. Margaret whispered, both stunned and relieved. He replied, stepping closer, "You don't have to do this." David's facade of composure began to crack. He clenched his jaw, clearly rattled by the interruption. He snapped, attempting to retain some semblance of control. Samuel shot back, unwavering. Margaret could feel the collective breath of the room held in anticipation. Samuel's words stirred something in her, a mix of anger and strength bubbling to the surface. She realized that her life and her happiness meant so much more than what was about to happen in this chapel. David urged, desperation creeping into his voice. She spat. The words tumbled from her lips, surprising even herself. Behind her, the pews were a sea of uncertainty. Some faces mirrored her fear and confusion, while others wore expressions of judgment and disapproval. But in that moment, Margaret didn't care. She was tired of being someone's pawn, tired of being told who she should marry or what dreams she should abandon. David growled, frustration dripping from his tone. "No," she countered, feeling a new fire burn within. "The mistake would be marrying a man who doesn't love me." Every tense moment was charged with possibility as the room filled with murmurs. Could she really walk away? The thought loomed large, but Samuel stood next to her, a reassuring presence amid the chaos. "Let's get out of here," he urged, his voice steady and calm. "You don't have to be afraid any longer." As those words sank in, something snapped inside Margaret. Maybe she had the power to change her fate. Maybe she didn't have to accept this life if it meant sacrificing her spirit. She took a deep breath, igniting the fire in her chest, and stepped toward the altar to face David, eyes blazing. "I won't marry you," she declared, her voice resonating with certainty. Every eye in the room fell on her, a mixture of shock and approval washing over the congregation. David's face twisted in anger, disbelief washing over him like a dark cloud. "You'll regret this," he warned, brow furrowing with menace. She shot back, her heart racing with exhilaration. Samuel called, extending his hand toward her. In that moment, Margaret felt the weight of her decision lift. With a single step, she turned away from the altar and took Samuel's hand, an anchor in a swirling storm. Together, they strode toward the exit, leaving behind the chains of expectation, walking straight into a newfound reality. As they burst through the doors of the church, sunlight flooded in, warm and inviting, wrapping around them like a long-lost embrace. The world lay before her vast, open, and bursting with potential. With one breath, she felt her spirit awaken, embrace freedom like it was a long-lost friend. She asked, adrenaline coursing through her veins, a mix of uncertainty and excitement bubbling beneath the surface. "Anywhere you want," Samuel replied, smiling. "We'll forge our own path." Margaret looked at him, realizing they were not just escaping. They were embarking on a journey to discover who they truly were, free from societal confines. For the first time in her life, she felt like she could dream again limitlessly and without fear. With laughter mingling in the air between them, they wandered through the grassy fields that surrounded the church, feeling the crunch of dirt beneath their feet. Each step was lighter than the last, a reminder that they no longer had to carry the weight of expectations. Days turned to weeks, and each moment together forged deeper bonds. Samuel introduced her to life beyond the confines of her father's farm, where dreams could blossom and hearts could soar. They worked side by side, sharing joys and burdens, exploring hidden paths and uncharted territories. Margaret discovered a fearless side of herself she never knew existed. With each new adventure, she embraced her creativity. She found joy in painting, filling canvases with vibrant colors, each brushstroke a declaration of freedom. It became her way of expressing the passions buried deep inside, a way of reclaiming her identity. As summer turned to autumn, the skies transformed into a canvas of warm hues. And in this newfound existence, Margaret realized she was no longer that scared girl in the white dress. She was a woman fueled by dreams, embracing a love that was waking up inside her, a love that felt like home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples, Samuel turned to her with a glint in his eyes. "You've changed so much," he said softly, admiration pooling in his gaze. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's because of you. You saw me for who I really am." Together they sat on a hillside, surrounded by fields of wildflowers, talking of dreams and future plans. Samuel spoke of adventures yet to unfold, and each word painted vivid pictures in Margaret's mind. They imagined a life filled with laughter, travel, and love, their love unfettered by expectations. Years passed and their bond only deepened. They built a home together, not one defined by bricks and mortar, but by laughter, warmth, and understanding. Margaret's passion for art flourished, her paintings now finding their way into galleries, a testament to her journey. Samuel was her rock, always supporting her dreams, celebrating every victory by her side. The day they finally visited the place where they first found their freedom felt monumental. Standing hand in hand outside the old church, Margaret felt her heart race. Memories flooded back, recollections of choices, fears, and the strength that had brought them to this moment. "Look how far we've come," she whispered, gazing at the structure that once held her captive, her emotions pooling at the brim. "You did it," Samuel replied, squeezing her hand, his eyes sparkling with pride. With laughter echoing through the air, they walked away from the shadows of the past and into the dazzling light of their future. Each step was symbolic, an affirmation of embracing choice over obligation, love over fear. And as they strolled into the sunset, Margaret knew that love was never a transaction. It was a choice, a beautiful, complicated, and ultimately rewarding journey. Together, they would navigate this road, ready to write new chapters, hand in hand, until the end of their days. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the heavy weight of expectation. Margaret stood nervously at the altar, her heart thrumming like a caged bird desperate to escape. Dressed in a pristine white gown that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of nuptial bliss, she looked out at the sea of familiar faces. They all beamed, waiting for what was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of her life. Instead, dread twisted her stomach into knots. Across from her, David stood with confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was nearly twice her age, slick-back hair catching the light, and a smile that hinted at ownership rather than affection. The priest was droning on about love and commitment, but Margaret couldn't focus on his words. All she could think about was the future being thrust upon her, a future built on her father's dreams and financial benefits, not her own choices. As David leaned closer, she could feel the oppressive aura of authority he exuded. The priest began, but even the question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Margaret felt trapped, the walls of the church closing in around her. She had never wanted this, never wished for a life of servitude cloaked in a bridal gown. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the church, snapping her out of her daze. The heavy doors flew open and a gust of wind rushed in. A figure burst through the threshold. It was Samuel, the farmhand who worked her father's fields. His shirt was dusty and his hair was windswept, but there was a fire in his eyes that drew all attention away from the ceremony. He shouted, breaking through the gloom of suffocating expectation. "Don't do this!" Gasps rippled through the congregation. Faces turned, some in shock, others in outrage, but all eyes now honed in on this sudden upheaval. Margaret felt herself lift off the ground, hope springing to life inside her as Samuel locked eyes with her. She whispered, both frightened and thrilled. He urged, stepping closer, his brow furrowed with concern. David's expression turned from smug confidence to furious indignation in an instant. He spat, trying to reclaim control. Samuel shot back, fierce conviction radiating from him. Margaret felt a rush of warmth at his words, a sudden swell of courage rising to meet her fear. For too long she had played along with this farce, suffocating under her father's ambitions. Samuel's presence, raw and unaffected, spread a fresh wave of resolve within her. David pressed, his tone now edged with desperation. Margaret took a shaking breath, her resolve solidifying as she faced David. "This isn't about my family," she declared, the fire in her voice growing hotter. The room held its breath. She saw uncertainty flicker across the faces of those who had come to witness her subservience, some lips parting in disbelief, while others began to nod, as if waking from a dream. "Margaret, you'll regret this," David warned, but his intimidation no longer held its power. She shouted, her voice breaking through the haze of compliance. With those words, Margaret found strength in herself, a strength she never knew existed. It felt as if the shackles binding her had finally shattered and hope fluttered in her chest. She turned to Samuel, who stood beside her, unwavering and resolute. He urged softly, his outstretched hand inviting her to step into a world of possibilities. Taking his hand felt like seizing a lifeline, and she glanced back at David one last time. The shock on his face ignited a thrill inside her. She turned away and walked toward the doors, where the light poured in, illuminating the way ahead. Freedom tasted sweet as they stepped outside into the warm sunlight. Margaret took a deep breath, welcoming the invigorating air as it filled her lungs. She felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of expectations that had held her captive for so long. She asked, glancing at Samuel, excitement and fear swirling in her heart. "Anywhere you want," Samuel replied, his eyes sparkling with determination. "We'll find our own way." A thrill ran through Margaret at the thought of the unknown stretching out before her. The world felt vast and filled with potential, and for the first time, she sensed the freedom to paint her own destiny. Days morphed into weeks as they ventured into life outside the confines of the church. Samuel found work at nearby farms, their days blending into a rhythm marked by hard work and laughter. They spent evenings under the stars, sharing dreams that came alive in the cool night air, exchanging stories of hope and freedom. Margaret realized how easily joy slipped back into her life, blooming like flowers breaking through concrete, vibrant and tenacious. She explored her passions. Art became her sanctuary, a way to express her spirit unfiltered by fear. Each stroke of the brush was a step toward reclaiming her identity, every vibrant color echoing the liberation swelling inside her. One evening, as they sat beneath a vast, starry sky, Samuel turned to her, a look of admiration etched across his face. "You've transformed so much already," he said softly, his voice a gentle caress. Margaret smiled, feeling a flutter in her chest. "It's because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," he asked, his eyes hopeful and steady. "Now I feel like I'm finally alive," she replied, sincerity radiating through her heart. As summer blossomed into autumn, Margaret and Samuel forged a deep bond, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. They faced challenges together, weathering storms that tested their resolve but also deepened their love. One crisp fall day, Margaret decided to return to the town where it all began. As they crested the hill leading to the chapel, her heart raced. Memories flooded back, the church looming larger than life, a ghost of her past. Samuel asked, his voice laced with concern. "I need to face it," she replied, determination in her voice. "I want to show that I am no longer a victim of my circumstances." As they approached the old structure, a mix of anxiety and exhilaration coursed through her veins. Stepping inside felt like walking into a time capsule of doubt and fear. The smell of polished wood and faint incense hung in the air, but Margaret held Samuel's hand, grounding her in the present. She could almost hear the echoes of the past, the whispers of hope and fear. "This is where I almost lost myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not that girl anymore," Samuel assured her, pride shining in his eyes. In that moment, Margaret realized how far she had come. This place no longer held power over her. It was merely a building filled with memories. Stepping back outside, she took a breath of fresh air, feeling lighter than ever. As they made their way back down the hill, hand in hand, Margaret looked over at Samuel, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I just helped you see the spark that was always there," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. The seasons changed, and their lives blossomed like the flowers in spring. They built a home filled with love, respect, and laughter. They hosted friends and family, their table laden with food and joy. Margaret's art flourished, with her work gaining recognition and respect throughout the town. But beyond the accolades, it was the simple moments that filled her soul. The evenings spent under the stars, long talks about dreams and futures, shared laughter, and the knowledge that they had chosen one another defiantly and deliberately. Years later, sitting on their porch surrounded by wildflowers, Margaret reflected on that fateful day, the moment that felt like a small spark ignited into a roaring fire. It was a choice that changed everything, a stand for freedom taken in the face of uncertainty. "Look at how far we've come," she said, looking out over the fields they had worked together. "We've only just begun," Samuel replied, his eyes filled with admiration. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret leaned against him, enveloped in the warmth of love and freedom. She realized that the life she built was not just about escaping the past. It was about celebrating every single choice that had led her here, a life filled with love, authenticity, and the courage to chase her dreams. In that moment, Margaret knew she wasn't just a girl who escaped captivity. She was a woman who carved her own path, crafting a legacy of strength and love that would echo through generations. Together, they would continue to write their story hand in hand, painting the canvas of their lives with every vivid stroke of hope and passion. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and a gust of wind swept through the chapel like an unwelcome intruder, interrupting the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the faint scent of flowers. Margaret stood at the altar, her heart pounding, feeling the weight of every eye in the room focused on her. Today was supposed to be a celebration of love, but all she felt was suffocation. Across from her stood David, a man nearly twice her age, with a smug grin plastered on his face. He towered over her, a symbol of everything she feared. As the priest began to recite the familiar words, they felt more like chains tightening around her heart. She could hardly breathe. Margaret was only 16, yet here she was, about to pledge her life to someone she barely knew. Her father had sold her into this arrangement, convinced that marrying off his daughter to a wealthy landowner would secure their future. She felt trapped, drowning in a sea of obligations and expectations, with no one coming to her rescue. Just as the priest continued with the sanctity of vows, an unexpected sound broke through the atmosphere, a loud crash as the doors burst open. A figure rushed in, breathless and wild-eyed. It was Samuel, the farmhand who worked on her father's estate. Dust swirled around his boots, but there was an unmistakable fire in his eyes as he took in the scene. He shouted, his voice cutting through the murmur of shock from the gathered crowd. "You can't marry him." Gasps echoed in the chapel, a ripple of disbelief spreading through the audience, and suddenly all eyes were on Samuel. Margaret's heart raced. Could he really be here to save her? She whispered, a mix of fear and hope flooding her chest. Samuel urged, stepping closer, urgency written all over his face. "You deserve better than this." David's demeanor shifted from confident to furious as he narrowed his eyes at Samuel. "How dare you interrupt?" His voice dripped with disdain, but it felt weak, almost desperate. Samuel shot back, "It's every woman's business." Margaret could feel the tension crackling in the air. It felt electric. Samuel was right. She had been taught to obey, but his defiance lit a spark inside her, a fire she didn't know was there. David thundered, trying to regain control. She took a deep breath, her courage swelling. "This isn't just about my family," she declared, finding her voice amid the chaos. "This is about me." The crowd buzzed, whispers flying like birds startled from their nests. Some nodded in agreement while others looked at her in horror. But Samuel stood firm, unwavering, a pillar of strength amid the storm. The words felt like thunder rumbling in her soul, shaking off the chains of expectation. David's face morphed into a mask of disbelief and anger. He yelled. "Not everything," she replied, her voice steady. The tension in the church was palpable. Margaret could feel murmurs shifting into waves of support from the back. Samuel called out, his hands reaching for her. In a decisive moment, she grasped his hand, and together they turned away from the altar. The path to the doors felt like stepping into a new world, and each step was filled with defiance and liberation. The heavy wooden doors swung wide, sunlight pouring in like a warm embrace. The outside air was crisp and fresh, a stark contrast to the stale confines of the church. Margaret breathed deeply, tasting freedom for the first time. She asked, exhilaration rushing through her veins. "Anywhere," Samuel replied, a grin breaking across his face. They walked away from the church, leaving behind not just a wedding, but the weight of a life that was never truly hers. The horizon stretched wide before them, filled with the promise of adventure and uncertainty. As daylight engulfed them, the world whispered infinite possibilities. Days turned to weeks, and things began to settle into a new routine. Samuel found work on nearby farms, and Margaret started to uncover her own dreams. While working the fields, she felt the sun on her skin and the earth beneath her feet, giving her a sense of belonging she had never felt in her sheltered life. In the evenings, they would sit beneath the stars, sharing stories and laughter, discussing their dreams like they were treasures buried deep inside. Margaret had forgotten the joy of dreaming until Samuel's presence reminded her. She found herself painting again, each stroke driven by the passion she had stifled for far too long. But the ghosts of her past loomed, reminders of a life half-lived. One day, while she was at the market, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd, her father. Her heart raced, panic gripping her like a vice. She ducked behind a stall, her pulse beating wildly in her chest. She heard him call, his voice slicing through the noise. The world felt like it was closing in. Would he make her go back? She felt Samuel's reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You don't have to go back," he whispered, his voice steady. Just as she contemplated fleeing, her father's gaze landed on her. She could see the fury brewing behind his eyes. He demanded, stepping forward. His anger was palpable, a storm brewing on the horizon. "I chose my own path, father," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "You'll regret this," he warned, but Margaret felt a flicker of courage ignite within her. She shot back, surprising even herself. Samuel stepped closer, his presence like armor against her father's rage. "Sir, it's time for you to let her go." Her father seethed, but Samuel's words acted like a bright light piercing through the dark clouds of doubt and anger. The townsfolk's eyes turned toward the confrontation. Some murmured in support of Margaret, while others stood with uncertainty. "Come with me, Margaret," her father said, extending a hand. "We can make this right." She shouted, her voice breaking through the tension. The faces in the market buzzed with whispers, the weight of her words sending ripples through the crowd. Margaret felt the eyes of strangers on her, and for the first time she welcomed their scrutiny. She was not just a daughter, she was a woman, choosing to carve her own identity. As tensions escalated, Samuel nodded toward the exit of the market, signaling for her to follow him. "Let's get out of here," he urged, his eyes silently pleading for her to take this leap of faith. But Margaret hesitated, looking back at her father, whose anger twisted his features into something unrecognizable. He shouted one last time, but she felt the strength of her choice surging through her. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just about running away. It was about standing her ground and embracing the woman she was becoming. She yelled back, determination shining in her eyes. She turned to run toward Samuel, who was waiting just beyond the edge of the market. Together, they ventured into the unknown, the weight of their decisions drawing them closer. As they stepped into the embrace of the trees outside the town, Margaret felt the chains of her past shattering behind her. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Each step felt like a rebirth, a renewed promise of freedom. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, a sudden rustle snapped Margaret back to the present. They weren't alone. Eyes watched them from the shadows, the unmistakable silhouette of a rider on horseback emerging from the tree line. Her heart sank as she recognized him. It was David, furious and determined. He shouted, his voice slicing through the crisp air like a blade. Panic washed over Margaret as she and Samuel turned to face him. David continued, his demeanor turning menacing. Fear gripped her, but then she felt Samuel's hand on her back, a grounding warmth radiating stability. He said firmly, stepping protectively in front of Margaret. David roared, his fury flaring like wildfire. "I'm not afraid of you," Samuel replied, standing tall, determined to shield Margaret from the storm brewing around them. The standoff sent adrenaline coursing through Margaret's veins. Would David force her back into a life she had fought so hard to escape? Her stomach twisted into knots at the thought. "Margaret," David sneered, "you may think you can run, but family always finds a way to pull you back." Looking into David's eyes, she felt a surge of defiance swell within her. She questioned, her voice steady. "You think being a pawn in your game of power is my destiny?" Rising anger ignited something fierce within her, and just as she thought she might finally break free of her past, a low, rumbling thunder echoed in the distance. The ground beneath them began to shake as the sky darkened, foretelling a storm unlike anything she had seen before. As lightning illuminated the trees, Margaret turned back to Samuel, a mixture of fear and determination brewing inside. She asked, breathless. Before Samuel could answer, David lunged forward, intent on reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. The moment stretched, teetering on the edge of chaos, as thunder crashed above them, a battle of wills unfolding in the heart of the storm. Margaret felt her heart race as she braced for the impending confrontation, wondering if this was the moment they would finally break free or if they would be swallowed by the darkness that loomed. As the lightning cracked above, illuminating the tumultuous scene, she knew one thing for certain. This was a fight for her life, and she would not back down. In that tumultuous moment where choices hung fiercely in the air, with thunder rumbling like a warning bell, Margaret stood poised at the precipice of her future, ready to face the storm head-on.